Good afternoon, everybody. We're so glad to have you here on a warm, unseasonably warm afternoon here in February. Um, Welcome to Disability and Voters' Rights, What You Need to Know. We know that this year is such an important election. And so I really felt like that this was a timely subject. I think that we all should take advantage of our right to vote here in this state. We're so gladly be partnering with Cheryl Jansen, an attorney and public policy director from Equip for Equality. A few housekeeping things. First of all, my name is Shelley Richardson, the executive director of the statewide Independent Living Council. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I am a middle-aged white female sitting in my office. I have glasses on and I have short red hair. If you have questions, you don't have to hold them till the end. You can either type your question in the question and answer area. Tara is going to be keeping track of that. Or if you would like to raise your hand, Tara can unmute you so that you can ask your question. Also, we have the chat area. If you are having some kind of question about the technicalities of the webinar, feel free to put it there. And like I said, we are recording this video today. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Cheryl.
Thank you, Shelley. I want to start out by thanking Silk for inviting me today and for all of you who are joining us for what I hope will be an informative hour, and because we know, as Shelley said, how critical it is that we participate in the upcoming elections. For those of you who may not be familiar with Equip for Equality, we are what is called the Protection and Advocacy System, which is typically referred to as the P&A for people with disabilities in Illinois. And Congress created the P&A system back in the 1990s to make sure that people with disabilities had legal advocacy for purposes of protecting and advocating for their rights. And so there is a P&A in every state in the union and every territory of the United States. So there's a counterpart like us everywhere. And as all P&As, we provide advocacy services in the areas of fundamental rights, employment, civil rights, special education, social services. We also investigate abuse and neglect in both public and private settings that serve children and adults with disabilities. And I'm going to talk a little later about the Help America Vote Act, but for right now, under the Help America Vote Act, we're required, because we're the P&A, to help ensure that voters with disabilities have full and equal access to the voting process. And so we do this in a variety of ways. We provide voting rights training, such as the one we're doing today. We register people to vote, both at events and at facilities and programs. And if there's anyone who is in attendance today who has an organization or a group for which they would like to have a voter registration drive, feel free to contact me and we can set that up. We also conduct accessibility surveys of polling places, and that includes early voting sites. And we have actually been involved in a multi-year venture with the Chicago Board of Elections, who is entered into a settlement agreement with the U.S. Department of Justice a number of years ago and pledged to make all of their polling places in the city of Chicago accessible. So we have been working with them to help them achieve that goal. We also work with election authorities across the state to help them improve access to voting, both physical access and making voting private and independent for voters with disabilities. We also assist people with filing complaints for violations of their voting rights. There is a process that is overseen by the Illinois State Board of Elections. And if you feel that your voting rights have been violated, you can file a complaint with them and they will investigate and render a decision. And so we can assist with the filing of those complaints. And we also conduct an election day helpline for every primary and general election, which means that we have people on hand to respond to questions and any problems that you may encounter on an election day. So that just kind of gives you the general flavor of our election activities. So as Shelley said, can't really emphasize enough how important it is to vote. It's a fundamental right for all United States citizens. And Tara, if you'd go to the next slide, please. And one more, because I should have caught you up before that. Okay, thank you. It's the way that we choose the elected officials, and they're the individuals who make decisions and rules and pass laws that affect our everyday lives. And it is by our vote that we can help to decide who stays in office and who does not. And I imagine that many of you are familiar with the name Justin Dart. Justin Dart was a very active and influential disability advocate who was instrumental in getting the Americans with Disabilities Act passed, and also co-founded the American Association of People with Disabilities. And he is often quoted as saying, vote as if your life depends on it, because it does. And so if where you live or who you live with, the healthcare you get, having access to quality education and jobs, and getting the services that you want and need are important to you, then it's absolutely important that you vote. Next slide, please, Tara. Unfortunately, over the years, people with disabilities have experienced a number of barriers to voting. And as a result, literally for decades, people with disabilities have been underrepresented at the polls. And so why has this happened? In large part, it has been due to inaccessible polling places and equipment. And as I mentioned before, we've been involved in a multi-year project with the Chicago Board of Elections to address these kinds of issues. And unfortunately, it's not, something that only has happened in the city of Chicago. There are still issues with this across the state. Also, people with disabilities have experienced discriminatory practices and attitudes from election officials and poll workers, perhaps guardians or their caretakers. For many years, and of course now we have newer and better options for voting, but for many years, when most people were dependent upon going to a physical polling place to vote, the lack of accessible and affordable transportation to their polling place has been an issue. And also in large part, it's because people with disabilities and their families and guardians, election officials and poll workers, and even service providers don't have a lot of knowledge about the voting rights of people with disabilities. And so hopefully programs like this will help to improve that. We still have work to do, however. I should also say that in recent years, on a positive note, I should have mentioned that in recent years, the turnout rate of voters with disabilities has improved. It has gone up. But voters with disabilities still vote at rates lower than voters without disabilities. So we clearly aren't there yet, and we need to keep working. All right, moving on. Want to talk about a couple of federal laws that impact the rights of people with disabilities when they vote. One is the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, or the ADA. And Title II of the ADA requires that people with disabilities have access and opportunity to exercise their right to vote that's equal to that provided to people without disabilities. And so in addition to having access to that government service, polling places also are required to comply with certain space requirements that pertain to polling places and the areas surrounding polling places. So it's the space in which people with disabilities have to vote. So there are requirements for how wide a hallway and a doorway needs to be, and ensuring that there's enough turning space at the voting machine, particularly for persons who use a wheelchair or a mobility device. And there has to be adequate space for walkways and also the parking spaces outside of the polling places. Next slide, please. So these ADA requirements that pertain to the space requirements are part of an overall ADA checklist to ensure that the spaces in and around polling places comply with federal law. And that means they must be accessible to voters with disabilities. Next slide, please. So I mentioned a little bit earlier the Help America Vote Act, or HAVA. And HAVA was passed to address some problems with voting systems and voter access that happened in the 2000 election. And just to give you a little bit of a history lesson, in that election, the two presidential candidates were Al Gore and George Bush. And after the election, the votes were very close. And particularly in the state of Florida, the votes were super close. They were only 537 votes apart. And so then there was a call for a recount of the ballots that had been cast in the state of Florida, which turned out to be quite the mess because at the time, ballots were punch cards. And so you had to punch through a mark on the card that contained the name of your candidate. But in many cases, that hole in the punch card wasn't complete. It didn't go all the way through. And so they had these hanging pieces, which they called hanging chads. And it raised the question whether the person really intended to vote for that candidate or not. And so ultimately, that election was decided by the US Supreme Court, and George Bush was determined to be the president. So HAVA was a major reaction to that fiasco. And it is that law is intended to improve access to the electoral process for all US citizens, but it has some very specific provisions for voters with disabilities. And I have to really say that disability advocates worked very hard when HAVA was being drafted and negotiated. And it is because of that hard work of those advocates that there are a couple of really important provisions that pertain to voters with disabilities. The first is that every polling place must have at least one accessible voting machine. And the other is that people with disabilities must be able to vote privately and independently. And unfortunately, this is probably the area where we continue to see the most problems, and something that we all should be striving to address. Next slide, please. So taken together, Title II of the ADA and the Help America Vote Act require election authorities to ensure that people with disabilities can vote privately and without assistance, whether they vote in person at a polling place or by mail from home. Next slide, please. So how do you register to vote? What do you need to do? Obviously, if you want to vote, the first step is registering to vote. And to register to vote, you have to be a United States citizen. You must be at least 18 years old by election day. But due to a more recent law, if you are 17 years old on the date of a primary election, and you will turn 18 by the date of the next general election, you can also vote in that primary at the age of 17. And you must also have lived in your election precinct at least 30 days before election day. The great thing about Illinois is that we now have voter registration all year, including on election day. And there was a time when there was a cutoff date after which, if you hadn't registered, you simply would have to wait until after the election and register and be able to vote in the next election cycle. So this is a huge improvement. Next slide, please. So what do you need to have with you when you go to register to vote? You have to have at least 2 pieces of identification, and at least one of them has to have your current address. So examples of that ID are a driver's license, an Illinois state ID card, a public assistance ID card, and this could include a Medicaid card, could be your Social Security card, a library card, a recent utility bill for electric or water, a credit card, or perhaps your birth certificate. And these aren't the only things, but there are some pretty common examples of the kinds of things that you could take with you and be able to register to vote. Next slide, please. So how do you register to vote and where can you do it? And again, Illinois has really greatly expanded options for voters in the last several years. And so you really do have some flexibility and options here. You can register to vote in person by going to your local election office. You can go to city, village, or township offices. In some cases, there are schools and public libraries where you can go to register to vote in person. And you can also register to vote in person when you apply for services at with various state agencies. So, for example, if you go to renew your driver's license, you can register to vote at the driver's license facility. You can do it at Department on Aging offices, also Department of Healthcare and Family Services offices, Department of Public Health offices, and the various offices and divisions of the Department of Human Services, which of course include mental health, developmental disabilities, and rehabilitation services. And actually, when you go to apply for services at these places, they are supposed to ask you whether you are registered to vote, and if not, whether you would like to be registered to vote. But unfortunately, there is really no one who is out there looking at this or enforcing this. And so there is some research to suggest that this doesn't happen as often as it should. So sometimes you just have to be proactive and ask for it if they don't ask you. Next slide. So how can you register to vote? Well, you can do it by mail. And so this means you're filling out a voter registration form and mailing it into your local election authority. And you can get that form from several places, including from your local election authority or by downloading it from the Illinois State Board of Elections website, which is www.elections.il.gov. You can also register to vote online if you have access to a computer. And to do that, you go to ovr.elections.il.gov. You'll need to have a valid email address and also provide a valid driver's license number or state ID card number when you go to register to vote online. And for the upcoming primary election on March 19th, the last day that you can register to vote online is March 1st. So that's coming up very shortly. And I'd also like to mention that if you registered to vote by mail or online and you didn't provide 2 forms of ID at the time that you registered, you'll need to provide them the first time you go to vote, but only that first time. And the other thing that I want you to know is that unlike many states, we have no photo ID requirement to vote in Illinois. So you don't need to bring a photo ID with you to vote if you are also already properly registered. Next slide, please. So after you register to vote, you can check your voter registration status online at the same website, www.elections.il.gov, by clicking on the link that's called Registration and Polling Place Information. And you can consider yourself registered to vote when you receive a voter ID card in the mail. And that card will also show you the name and the address of your polling place. But if by some chance you don't receive an ID card within 3 weeks after you register to vote, be sure you contact your local election authority to see what the holdup is so that you'll be prepared when election day rolls around. Next slide, please. So we also have something in Illinois which expands opportunities to vote, and that is called grace period registration and voting. So this process lets you register to vote or update your address through election day. And it starts the 27th day before the election. And if you register to vote using this process, you'll have to vote your ballot at the same time that you register to vote. This type of registration and voting is offered at your local election authority's office. It's also available at early voting sites starting 15 days before an election, at designated permanent polling places, and at certain polling places on election day. And so if this is something that you want and need to do, contact your local election authority to find the locations and the hours for grace period registration and voting. Next slide, please. We also have something called early voting here in Illinois. And this means that registered voters can vote before election day by going to an early voting location. It starts 40 days before an election, and it continues until the day before the election. So before you vote, it's important to check with your local election authority about the hours and locations for early voting in your area. And as with any polling place, by law, all early voting locations must be physically accessible to voters with disabilities. Next slide, please. So Illinois has expanded early voting in the last several years. Right now, early voting sites have to be open during the 15 days before an election from 8:30 in the morning to 4:30 in the afternoon, or from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. on weekdays. During the 8 days before an election, early voting locations must be open from 8:30 a.m. to 7 p.m. or 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. on weekdays. And also from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. on Saturdays and holidays, and from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. on Sundays. So you have a lot of options and flexibility in terms of when you early vote. And for this upcoming primary election on March 19th, the last day for early voting is the day before the election, March 18th, 2024. We also now have in Illinois something called vote by mail. And this used to be called absentee voting. You may remember that. It's been a few years now since absentee voting went by the wayside. But to absentee vote, you had to have some reason or excuse why you couldn't go to your polling place to vote on election day. With vote by mail, that is not an issue. Anyone can vote using a vote by mail ballot, and you don't need to give any reason or excuse to do that. You can request an application for a vote by mail ballot by mail or in person or online from your local election authority. You must fill out the application and return it to the local election authority, either in person or by mail. You can request a vote by mail ballot starting 90 days before the election, up until 1 day before the election, if you do it in person, or 5 days before the election, if you do it by mail or online. Next slide, please. If you apply in person at your local election authority, you can immediately vote your ballot there. If you apply by mail or online, you'll receive a ballot in the mail, which you must fill out and return to your local election authority by mail, in person, or in a designated mail drop box. So if you're interested in depositing it in a mail drop box, then you should contact your election authority to find out where in your area those drop boxes are located. You'll also need to use the envelope that's given to you that comes with the vote by mail ballot, and you must sign it and seal it as instructed. So vote by mail starts the 40th day before the election, and you can receive help marking your vote by mail ballot. If you return your completed ballot by mail, then the person that helped you must sign the envelope stating that they provided you with assistance. If you return your ballot by mail, and this is important, make sure that it's postmarked on or before election day to ensure that it is counted. And luckily in Illinois voters now have the option to permanently register to vote by mail. So rather than having to apply to vote by mail for each and every election, you will automatically receive vote by mail ballots in the mail until such time as you opt out. So that is also a great option, and further expands flexibility when it comes to voting. Next slide, please. As of a couple of years ago, we have something in Illinois called remote accessible vote by mail. And this means that the State Board of Elections is required to provide a certified remote accessible vote by mail system that allows voters with print disabilities to receive, mark, and verify their vote by mail ballots electronically using their own assistive technology. So for purposes of this requirement, voters with print disabilities include people who are blind, have low vision, have cognitive impairments, or learning disabilities, or manual dexterity limitations. It would include all of those persons and voters. Next slide, please. So if you want to use the remote accessible vote by mail system, you have to complete what's called an application for accessible vote by mail and return it to your local election authority. And so you can do this for either a single election or for permanent vote by mail, so that you don't have to do that over and over again. And so I have provided a link here in the slides for where on the State Board of Elections website you can look up the contact information for your local election authority in order to do that. Next slide, please. So if you use remote accessible vote by mail, after you vote your ballot, you have to print it out, sign it, and return it to the local election authority. But because this system does not allow voters with print disabilities to return their voted ballots electronically, they have to seek assistance from a voter without a print disability to complete the process. Next slide, please. In other words, the only way we're going to make a remote accessible vote by mail accessible to all voters with print disabilities is to allow their voted ballots to be returned electronically, again, using their own assistive technology. This is the only way that those voters will have the ability to vote by mail privately and independently, just as any other voter has the ability to do. There is a bill pending in the Illinois General Assembly right now, Senate Bill 3220, that would allow voters with print disabilities to return their vote by mail ballots electronically starting in 2025. Equip for Equality and other disability advocates have been working to secure electronic ballot returns since the year 2020. And so we were very disappointed that the legislation would not allow for electronic ballot return in the upcoming presidential election in November. So right now we are out there advocating for an amendment to the bill to allow electronic ballot return for the 2024 presidential election. This technology exists and it has existed for years and been successfully used for years. In a majority of the states in Illinois, 32 states already have electronic ballot return. So this is really something that Illinois needs to get behind and to implement. Next slide, please. And of course, we've talked about all kinds of options now for people to be able to vote. And we should not forget that just as there has always been, you have the option to go to your polling place on election day to vote. Don't have to, but you can. And there are people who absolutely prefer to do this. So that is also available. What if you need some assistance when you go to vote? If you do need help, you can literally get help from any person you choose, as long as that person isn't your employer or an officer of a union that you belong to, or a candidate whose name is on the ballot. Other than those three categories, you can choose anyone you wish. It doesn't need, it can be a relative, it can be a friend, it can be a coworker, it can be anyone that you trust to provide you with assistance when you vote. It doesn't need to be an adult. It doesn't need to be someone who's a registered voter, and it doesn't need to be someone who speaks English. So you really have a lot of flexibility in terms of who you choose to help you vote if you need it. Of course, you know, if you do seek assistance, that person is not allowed to try to influence you to vote in a certain way. That is completely up to you, and that is your decision. And if you do get assistance from someone when you go to vote, then that person will have to sign a paper stating that they assisted you in voting. Next slide, please, Tara. If you decide you get to the polling place or the early voting site and you decide that you need to have help, but you didn't bring anyone with you, you can ask the election judges for help when you vote. And if you do, there will be 2 election judges, one from each major political party, a Democrat and a Republican, to assist you in the voting booth. And as with, if you bring someone with you to the polls, if you ask for help from the election judges, you'll have to sign a paper stating that you requested assistance from them. One other thing that I want to be sure to mention is that in Illinois, it does not matter whether you have a guardian, you have a right to vote. There are many states in the US in which guardians have a say-so as to whether or not the person with a disability is allowed to vote. The only way that could happen in Illinois is if in the guardianship order that is entered by the court, the guardian was given that right to oversee whether or not the person would be able to vote. And I have been an attorney for almost 30 years, and I have never seen a guardianship order that retained that kind of authority in a guardian. Next slide, please. So there also should be some things on hand when you go to vote to assist people with voters with disabilities. Every polling place, whether that's an early voting site or an election day polling place, should have available instructions that are printed in large type, displayed at both each registration facility and each polling place. There should be available a magnifying lens to place over the ballot. There should be sample ballots in large type. If you need a large handled stylus, it should also be present at that site. There should be information by telecommunications devices for people who are deaf or hard of hearing. And as we talked about earlier under HAVA, there has to be at least one electronic voting machine with accessibility features, and that includes audio mode for people with visual disabilities. Next slide, please. If you want to vote in person, but you can't enter your polling place because it's not accessible, or because you have limited mobility to enter the polling place, you can request what's called curbside voting. And curbside voting can be done during either early voting or on election day. And so with curbside voting, 2 election judges, again, one from each major political party, must bring the ballot out to you. You, however, cannot be more than 50 feet away from the polling place. They're not required to go beyond that. But you could certainly be in your car, pulled up along the sidewalk, and someone can, bring out the ballot to your car, or if you're, on the sidewalk, seated in a mobility device, they can bring it out to you there. And if you do this, then you'll mark your ballot and give it back to the election judges, who will make sure that it's counted inside the polling place. Next slide, please. If you do want to use curbside voting, you really should call your local election authority to request that at least one day before you vote. That's just the best way to make sure that you'll be able to do this, because then they're prepared and they know that you are coming and where you are coming to do curbside voting. If for some reason, you didn't know you were going to need curbside voting, or you didn't have an opportunity to call in advance, I would hope you would still be able to arrange for curbside voting on the day you vote. But I would call before you go to the early voting site or the polling place. Call the election authority to make sure that they can accommodate that request. Next slide, please. So what if you are someone who is a resident of a nursing home? If you have lived there for more than 14 days before the election, you can request a vote by mail ballot. And if that happens, then at least 2 judges, again, one from each major political party, will come to the nursing home on either the Friday, Saturday, Sunday, or Monday before election day and supervise the voting. You use a vote by mail ballot for this process, and the election judges must return the ballot to be counted. Next slide, please. It may be that something comes up, you have a health condition and you're admitted to a hospital or some kind of healthcare facility within a short period of time of the election. And so do you have an option to vote then? And the answer is yes. As long as you're registered to vote and you're admitted to either the hospital or a nursing home or a rehabilitation center, and it's less than 14 days before the election, you can still vote. You have to get what's called an application for ballot for qualified voter admitted to hospital, nursing home, or rehabilitation center. You'd think they could come up with a shorter title for that, wouldn't you? From your local election authority, and you must fill it out. And you'll also have to have your doctor fill out a section of the application and sign the form too. Next slide, please. A legal relative or a registered voter who lives in the same precinct that you do then can go in person to the election authority's office to hand in the form. And they'll then be given a ballot to deliver to you at the healthcare facility. You can then vote the ballot and place it into the envelope that is given to you. And then the person who obtained the ballot for you must return it to the local election authority before 7 p.m. on election day, because that is the time that the polls close. Okay. Also wanted to be sure that you know that, as I mentioned before, we do conduct what we call our election day helpline. And this means that we have staff available to answer any questions or problems that you may experience on election day. And so for the upcoming primary election on March 19th, our helpline will be open from 6 a.m. to 7 p.m. And you can call with your questions or reports to our toll-free number, which is 800-537-2632, or you can send an email to voting@equipforequality.org. And please don't hesitate to call if you have any questions or any problems during the next election. And with that, I will stop the formal presentation and hopefully we will have some questions and some conversation. And so thank you everyone for your attention.
I do want to say, if you encounter a problem at the polling place, don't let it go. Because if you let it go, the next person behind you is going to have the same problem. Be your own advocate and be an advocate for other people coming after you. Let's make sure that our polling places are doing what they're supposed to be doing.
I absolutely agree, Shelley. And I should have said that, we troubleshoot. So if you call and tell us there's a problem at a certain precinct or a certain polling place, we don't just take your complaint. We will reach out to the election authorities and try and get whatever the problem is fixed. Sometimes there'll be cases when there's no accessible voting machine at a polling place. And, we can call and make sure that the election authority gets out there. Maybe there's a poll worker who doesn't know how to operate the accessible voting machine. or the setup at the polling place is inaccessible. Those are all things then that we can reach out and contact the local election authorities about, because whenever we can, we will try and fix it on election day. Some things that's not possible, but we do our best to see that that happens.
We do have a question in the Q&A. In regards to voting privately and independently, is it legal for poll workers to shout out my name and affiliate party and check where I'm from? As a deaf person, when I check in at the voting polls to vote, I show them my voter card and ID and I sign in, and I notice this is what they do all the time.
I don't think that's appropriate. If you are registered to vote and you're providing them with documentation that you are this person and that you're registered to vote at this location, I don't see the necessity for calling out your name in particular. Well, let me qualify that. If you're voting in a primary election, you have to declare a party to vote. We don't have open voting here in Illinois. So you either will get a ballot with Republican candidates or a ballot with Democratic candidates. And so I would imagine that poll workers will look at it and say to the person, because they usually, each one has a different job, to the next person down the line, I need a Democratic ballot. So, I mean, that is going to occur. But I don't know why they would have to announce your name in association with that. And I think if something like that happened, I would call to complain about it.
As a former poll worker, I can tell you that is unnecessary.
It totally is.
When Herschel goes in, he just needs to give his name, and then the first person at the judge's table will look up and pull his card.
Mhm.
And that person will ask you Democrat or Republican, but then they can just look to the person next to them and say Republican, and then the person next to them can look at the person that's handing out a ballot and just discreetly say Republican. It doesn't need to be that way.
No, not at all. Your identity should not be public information. So I would, if that would to happen to you again, I would report it and complain.
One other question was just if the slides would be shared, Cheryl, if that's okay with you, I can share them with everybody who's.
Oh, absolutely. Please do.
Does anybody want to raise their hand and ask their question out loud? All right. Again, I want to say I can't emphasize enough how important this year is. So please vote as if your life depends on it.
Because it really does.
Mm-hmm. Somebody has their hand raised, Cheryl, looks like.
It's me, Laura.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so this election, I understand they're going to use an electronic sign-in device, kind of like you do at the grocery store. So I was curious what they've come up with for people, as you were saying, that have a hard time manual dexterity to be able to sign their name.
And that is a good question that I unfortunately do not know the answer to. But let me see if I can find out, and I can share the information with Shelley and she can share it with you all. Because I
great,
do
thank
know
you.
what kind of device is good. And now, where are you from? Are you in Cook County or where are you?
I'm in Lake County, and
Lake
we had a voter education event where they brought all the voting stuff for us to try, and it's a stylus that has a rubber wheel on the bottom so that it holds it stably. But even so, it's still a pen, and you're writing on a tablet. And I don't know if everybody's can do that as easily as I don't think everyone's able to do that.
Yeah.
So I was just curious what they have in place.
And do you think that that's specific to Lake County, or
No.
was it your understanding that they're going to do that statewide?
I don't know about statewide, but I do know that DuPage and Kane, they told us that DuPage and Kane were also doing that.
Gage, Canyon Lake. Okay, let me see what I can find out.
Okay,
Did
thank
they,
you.
did they show you more than one device when you went to that event?
No.
It was just that thing. Okay. Thanks for asking the question, and hopefully I can get some information for you.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
If I will say also that if you know that your local election authority is asking for judges for the election, what a wonderful time for those of us with disabilities to step up and become election judges, because then we're right in the place and we know what it's allowed and what's not allowed. And so I was probably the least favorite person of the group when I worked as an election judge, but I was there to make sure it was done correctly.
Mhm.
And yeah, I did have a couple of um, words with some of the election judges that I was working with, and when I made them do it correctly. So
It's really a great opportunity if you have the time and the ability to do. I have done it. It's a great educational experience, I think. Very interesting, especially for big elections like a presidential election. And it does give you the opportunity to educate other poll workers. And I will tell you, and I'm sure Shelley knows this too, there are some poll workers who have been doing this forever. And
yes.
so they do it the same way, and they think that that's the only way and the right way.
Mhm.
And sometimes they need educating. And so it really is, I would encourage anyone who can to do it at least once, because it's quite something.
So Tara, did we have any other hands raised or any other questions?
No.
Okay. Well, before I let you go, I want to remind you that right after this presentation, there'll be a very brief survey. We would be very glad if you would take the time to answer those questions. And I want to thank Cheryl for taking her time today to make this presentation. You will be receiving the slides, and we will be posting this recording on the Silk website. That's Silk, SILC of Illinois. You'll be able to relook at it there. And with that, I will give you the rest of your afternoon off. Thanks, Cheryl.
Thank you, Shelley, and thank you
Okay.
all for attending.
Thanks. Bye-bye.